Hello and welcome to Final Justice. I'm John Walsh. Growing up is never easy. It's even tougher when you're coming of age under the watchful eye of an abusive father and a submissive mother. Growing up in that troubled environment, Larry Donald George never stood a chance of making it. He learned only one lesson: got to be tough to survive. Sadly, innocent victims would wander into George's path and discover just how tough he could be.
Get the shower, get in uniform, get up to Cleo's office.
George never had much direction in his life until he joined the U.S. Army. They stationed the Alabama native in Germany, where he was not a model soldier.
Based on your past court-martial convictions, it is my recommendation that you be reduced in rank and discharged from the United States Army.
During his military career, George was careless and disobedient, with little regard for authority. He left the Army in November 1986, but he took away skills he would carry with him for years. George and his wife, Geraldine, returned to Alabama, but he was not happy there. He took his anger out on her.
You don't ask me any questions, you hear? You do what I tell you.
Out of the 5 years that we was really married, the happiest day was when I left him and got in my own place.
The couple separated, and Geraldine wanted a divorce, but George kept close tabs on her activities. February 12, 1988, he headed to Talladega, Alabama, to find Geraldine. She ran to a neighbor for protection.
Janice, call the police. Larry's outside with the gun.
First, George shot Janice Morris, the neighbor. Then he went after Geraldine. His next bullet tore through her arm, then severed her spine. George stopped Ralph Swain, the neighbor's fiancé, with a single bullet to the head. Both Janice and Ralph were murdered, victims of Larry George's sick obsession. Geraldine was more fortunate, but her injuries had left her paralyzed, confined to a wheelchair. Looking back, she bore the guilt for her husband's cruelty.
I blame myself. No, not totally. I leave 75% of it for him.
Only Larry George didn't stick around to accept his responsibility or his punishment. Law enforcement searched for him for more than a year, but he seemed to have disappeared.
America's Most Wanted.
In April 1989, America's Most Wanted joined the manhunt, but still no results. June 17, 1990, police watched George's third profile, and so did millions of television viewers. A flurry of calls to the hotline was about to spark an intense manhunt.
7-Eleven owner in Delaware, and this is one of a common customer, George is.
Police tracked George to Wilmington, Delaware. A clerk confirmed that he was a regular at the 7-Eleven convenience store.
Looks like a loose curl. I throw Willie. I remember him playing lottery a few times, but usually I don't think he comes in during the day.
Neighborhood residents directed a Wilmington Police Department SWAT team to a nearby field.
We took it slow. We were wary of booby traps, things like that from this gentleman's military training.
There they found the remains of a makeshift tent, but no sign of its owner. George had built himself a quiet haven in the woods, but he'd abandoned it and moved on. Then local residents led police to a rundown house in the city, and the heat was on. Armed and ready to take the fugitive down, police surrounded the house, but when they stormed in, George had vanished.
Next, two cops go fishing for one of America's most wanting to waste.
Larry Donald George was one of the most elusive fugitives America's Most Wanted ever chased. He was profiled every year for 5 years. Dozens of tips poured in, but each time George managed to stay one step ahead of the law until April of 1994. A caller provided a new lead that broke the case wide open.
So as we were walking up, we heard the radio on and saw a television right next to the radio, and some tea was brewing in a pan.
This gasoline-powered generator made it possible. George had all the comforts of home, including a stash of sweets, video games, even a cellular phone.
With all that equipment here, it really surprised us, and we knew there had to be a lot more.
There was. George wasn't just battling the wilderness. He was prepared to fight human foes as well. His campsite concealed an arsenal, with enough firepower for a small army. But there was even more to come. Police found an underground hideout stocked with additional supplies and weapons, including this spear gun.
Get a map of the Wilmington Industrial Park, please.
Based on their discovery, detectives Quentin Watson and Bruce Pinkett planned to search the total area of the Wilmington Industrial Park. But first, the detectives wanted a closer look at the territory. Fishing rods in hand, they decided to go undercover.
The minute I saw him out of the corner of my eye, I tried to stay calm, and I told Detective Watson, don't turn around too quickly. Someone's coming up from your right hand, over your right hand shoulder.
That someone turned out to be Larry Donald George. He asked the startled detectives if they planned on going fishing.
We said, yeah. What kind of fish? What kind of good catches are here? And he said, catfish, and he started to show us his catch for the day.
Watson and Pinkett wanted to land their own catch, but George struggled as the detectives tried to handcuff him. They shoved him into the river, and he waded off. As the detectives called for backup, George hid in a rusty tugboat, but his run was finally over.
At that time, we also had a helicopter that was coming down lower and lower to the water, making a lot of noise. So he really couldn't think that clearly, and finally he just gave up.
The police were waiting for George on shore. So was a camera crew, watching as officers hauled him in.
They were giving Mr. George instructions on what to do. Put your hands up. Throw your pants down. He threw his pants in front of him, just to make sure for officer safety, so he didn't have any weapons.
George came out of the river, but he was still in hot water. After 6 years on the run, he headed back to civilization to receive final justice.
They need to face it and experience some of the pain. He done all of this, and I need to be strong and show him I'm still here. And I'm still me, and you're not going to hurt me no more.
Detectives Pinkett and Watson escorted George from Delaware back to Talladega, Alabama. On November 14th, 1994, George was brought to the Talladega courthouse, charged with attempted murder and 2 counts of capital murder. Geraldine prepared herself to testify against him.
A little shocking feeling went through me, like this is it. It's like it was just a wake up. This is reality now. You don't have to think, you don't see pictures. This is reality.
Prosecutor Robert Rumsey headed into court with a lot of confidence. He knew the case against George would be hard to beat.
Even though you had 2 dead people, you had a victim that could say, he fired the shot coming into the apartment, he pointed the gun at me, and he shot me.
For Geraldine, this was payback time. A bullet from Larry George's gun had paralyzed her legs, but not her heart. She turned her own weapons on George. Determination, courage, and the truth.
Inside, my heart was just skipping all kind of beats. But I just never let him know I was afraid.
The defense called no witnesses of their own. The trial was over after only 3 days. The jury took less than an hour to return their verdict. Guilty on all counts. They sentenced George to death. For Geraldine, it was a long-awaited victory over the man who had tormented her.
I wanted to let him know he didn't break me. He might have hurt me, but he wasn't gonna break me. He took their life without them having a choice. Now they're gonna take his without him having a choice.
Larry Donald George now sits on Alabama's death row. He will continue to try to avoid final justice by appealing his sentence. But for Geraldine, it's as though her life is just beginning.
In my family, I had a lot of strong support to move on, be strong, because I'm still here, thank God. I still got my mind to move on as if it just never did exist.
Next.
Watch and be heard.
Oklahoma police say a serial killer may be on the loose. A butcher responsible for killing at least 4 women. Nobody knows who the killer is. And until now, the identity of the victims has remained a mystery as well. But now, we're asking you to help us identify these victims. Help stop a killer in his tracks and bring him to final justice.
My wife and I were coming down to find a place to fish, and I was just looking along the side of the bank trying to find a place to put a line in, and seen some debris there and logs and floats and what have you. I thought it was a big fish that had washed up on the bank, and Of course, that was rather exciting until I realized that it was a body.
Well, it was at afternoon hours of May the 7th, 1988. A fisherman reported to the Cherokee County Sheriff's Department that they had found a body floating in the Grand River just south of the Fort Gibson Dam. The officers responded, and with the help of the Oklahoma Lake Patrol, they was able to retrieve the body.
As we neared the body, we could tell that she had been anchored down with a concrete block tied with a telephone cable.
It appeared that she was clasping that block around her stomach. Very horrible. The body was that of a young white female. She was wearing a pullover type shirt, 3/4 length sleeves, and an inscription across the front of the shirt which stated, "Love is like a butterfly. It goes wherever it pleases and pleases wherever it goes." On her right hand, she was wearing a single ring, a silver with 3 sets in it, and on her left hand, she was wearing 2 rings. The medical examiner's office reported to us that on her left shoulder was a tattoo of a daisy, a yellow flower with 4 green leaves, and from that day on, we referred to her as Daisy Jane Doe. A certain period of time, she was laid to rest in the Tahlequah Cemetery here in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. The other investigators, myself, we still continue hoping that we will be able to identify her, because in order to find her killers, we first have to know who she is.
Nearly 8 years have passed since Oklahoma authorities discovered Daisy Jane Doe. With all their leads exhausted, investigator Jack Goss asked America's Most Wanted for help.
America's Most Wanted, I feel we'll never know who she is without their help.
America's Most Wanted knew it was a tough case with very little to go on. The tattoo, the sweatshirt, and the 3 rings were the only hard evidence to work with. In order to solve this murder, a better image of what Daisy Jane Doe really looked like and who she really was vital. In April of 1994, authorities working with America's Most Wanted exhumed the body of Daisy Jane Doe and transported her to the medical examiner's office in Oklahoma City. Dr. Clyde Snow, a forensic anthropologist for the state of Oklahoma, examined the remains to see if there were any additional clues that might reveal something about Daisy Jane Doe.
One feature that interested me, the teeth are in very good condition. Also, she was apparently a non-smoker. The teeth are not ringed with the heavy tar deposits that we see in smokers. So we can estimate her height to be about 5 foot 5 inches. One clue to age are these thread-like lines that course across the surface of the skull. In her case, they're still open, although there's perhaps some early closure back in this area, which suggests that she is in her 20s or 30s.
Armed with this scientific information, America's Most Wanted asked 2 forensic artists, sculptor Betty Gatliff and sketch artist Karen Taylor, to create a facial reconstruction using Daisy Jane's skull as the base for their work.
The first stage is to take the information obtained from Dr. Snow and go to the appropriate tissue depth chart. So I have used the information for white females and glued rubber eraser material at these different points around the face.
These measurements were made on cadaver material that takes into consideration the size of the muscle, the fatty tissue, and the skin thickness all in one measurement. I taper the clay from one depth to the next, and this gives me the shape of the face.
To determine the outline of her face, I will literally just connect the dots of these tissue depth markers, following the contours around her cheekbone, around her jaw line, down to her chin.
I can't visualize a face when I see a skull. I have to put it together step by step.
We've determined that the lips can be pretty much approximated by having the mouth the width of the front 6 teeth.
The first feature I add is the mouth. Then I move on to the eye, building the eyelids, then to the nose, and then the ears are the last feature.
It's so important that we, in law enforcement, give it every effort to identify bodies for multiple reasons. In the case of Daisy Jane Doe, we know that she was murdered, and it's extremely difficult, if not impossible, for the police officers to investigate her homicide without knowing her identity first.
But with the completion of Karen Taylor's sketches and Betty Gatliff's sculpture, discovering Daisy Jane Doe's identity was becoming more of a reality. The next step was to take the two forensic images and combine them into one. Two computer graphic facilities, Viewpoint Data Labs and Video Central, joined forces to create a 3D lifelike model by joining the two forensic artworks together.
In this package, we'll, of course, go in and sharpen up edges. We'll go and create eyelids and that type of thing that may get lost in digitized data. We can create a higher resolution of the model, which will actually look, after it's got its textures and its coloring, it will actually look like the head that was provided to us to duplicate.
And now, from the marriage of art and science, from a mixture of hope and fear, there comes a face. The face of Daisy Jane Doe.
We always felt that if we could identify her, we could possibly find her killer or killers. That's a killer out there someplace. This may not be his only victim. He may still be active. Yes, we want to find out who he is. Somebody's missing Daisy Doe. It could be children. It could be mother, father, sisters, or brother. But somebody's missing her.
Remember, Daisy Jane Doe was wearing these 3 rings and had this tattoo of a daisy on her left shoulder. She was also wearing a sweatshirt like this one. Now, every face has 1,000 looks. We hope these renderings capture a part of Daisy Jane's essence. Forensic artists who created them are among the best in the country, and their work has often been incredibly accurate. If you have any information at all and can help give Daisy Jane back her real name, please call our hotline at 1-800-CRIME-TV. And remember, you can remain anonymous.
Next.
See 100%. Police in Oklahoma fear they may have a serial killer on their hands. In recent years, 4 women, all bearing a striking resemblance, have been brutally murdered. Bodies have been exhumed and their faces reconstructed. Investigators fear the deaths of these 3 women and the murder of Daisy Jane Doe are the work of the same killer. On June 24th, 1987, 1.5 miles off Interstate 35 near Paoli, the skeletal remains of a white female were found by 2 fishermen. Paoli Jane Doe was in her late 20s or early 30s. She was approximately 5 foot 3 inches tall. On January 5th, 1990, another body floated by surveyors in a creek outside El Reno, between Interstate 40 and Highway 66. El Reno Jane Doe was either a white female or an American Indian in her late 20s to 30s and stood about 5 foot 5 inches tall. And on October 23rd, 1994, Dora Jane Doe was found 2 miles south of I-40 on Highway 64D. Dora Doe was between the ages of 30 and 50 and stood about 5 foot 6 inches tall. She could be white, Asian, or Native American. Now remember, all 3 of these victims were brutally murdered. So if you even remotely suspect that you know one of these ladies, please call our hotline at 1-800-CRIME-TV. That's all for this edition of Final Justice. I'm John Walsh. Thanks for watching.